Okay, sir, should I begin?
Ah, yes, Sumit.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Uh, okay, let me
And
introduce you. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Myself, Dr. Samit Kumar Maiti, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of English and IQAC Coordinator of Seva Bharati Mahavidyalaya. Now, as the organizing secretary and convener, I cordially welcome to you to the third and last day of the three-day international webinar on imagining catastrophe, literary and cultural representations of environmental disaster, organized by the Department of English and IQAC Seva Bharati Mahavidyalaya. This is the fourth technical session, and this is also the parallel session. And in this parallel session, we have 10 paper presenters. And this session will be chaired by Dr. Snehasis Maiti, Associate Professor, Department of English, Kontai PK College, Purbo Mendipur. Let me introduce Dr. Snehasis Maiti to you all. Uh, Dr. Snehasis Maiti is Associate Professor of English, Prabhat Kumar College, Kontai, Purbo Mendipur, West Bengal. He has done his doctoral research work on Indian diasporic writers, including Solomon Rushdie, Rohinton Mistry, and Bharati Mukherjee. He has also carried out two UGC-sponsored minor research projects on the partition, 1947 novels, and Bengali Dalit writers. His publications include his book, The Diasporic Vision, published by LAP, Germany, research articles in a host of journals and translations. He has supervised doctoral theses on Amitabh Ghosh and translation studies. His areas of research interest are Indian English and diasporic writing, post-colonial literature, translation studies, and subaltern studies. So, with this very brief introduction, I now request Dr. Snehasis Maiti to kindly take over the charge of chairing the session.
thank you, Sumit, for this very kind introduction. And I thank also the organizers of this seminar for inviting me to chair the session. I welcome all the paper presenters and, of course, the listeners on this virtual platform. I must particularly thank Sumit and his team for organizing an international webinar on such a vital issue. The issues like environment management, environmental disaster, and its cultural and literary representations. I hope all the paper presenters here they will do justice to the focal theme. Since we are constrained by time,
Yes.
I will not lengthen my speech here. Maybe at the end of the session, when we shall be looking at the papers together, we can have another round of discussion. There are 10 presenters, and each presenter, I think, has been given a time limit of 5 minutes. So I request the paper presenters to stick to the time limit. And Sumit, are we following the sequence as given in your schedule,
Yes.
or is there any alteration?
No, no alteration. There is only a slight alteration, and we will add just one paper presenter at the end of the session.
Okay. So going by that order, I would first invite Ananda Lakshmi Nayak to present the paper. Ananda, are you there?
Yes, I am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. So
Right. I'll
go on.
present, yes, I'll present my screen. Could you please let me know if my screen is visible?
Yes.
Yes,
All,
it's visible.
all right, all right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ananta Lakshmi Nair, and I'm pursuing my master's in English literature from St. Xavier's College. And the title of my research paper is Disaster Drawn, Environmental Disaster in Comics. Moving on to the thesis, just a minute. All right. So, the focus on eco-cosmopolitanism as a necessary component of any imaginative or real discourse about the future has its roots in political ecology and the way that political ecologists have, thus far, attempted to understand disasters in relation to human societies and the natural world, where these two things have too long been considered separate instead of integrated. Although disaster studies are treated differently by sociologists, historians, anthropologists, and other disciplines, uh, political ecology provides a clear eyed approach to disaster studies because this branch of disaster study investigates the political and economic structures, policies, and forces that influence and shape the human use of the environment. And it stresses environmental use and misuse in a way that other socio-cultural investigation does not. So, my usage of political ecology throughout my analysis is in line with this conception of political ecology, which incorporates a more radical environmental philosophical underpinning. Primarily, though, I am concerned with the ways that environmental attitudes and practices are deeply rooted in historical, cultural, religious, and political structures. I'm equally concerned with what I take to be the fact that changes in these attitudes and practices will require radical changes to our lifestyles, values, interpersonal relationships, and how we understand our place in nature. Right. Now, disaster dystopias can be instructive in furthering the analysis of apocalyptic ecology in two important ways. First is how near future dystopias that incorporate severe environmental decay often display the readiness with which people believe a failing environment is something that can be overcome no matter how bad it gets. Secondly, where the environmental destruction is so complete as to render the world inhospitable, we often get striking, if limited, access to how dystopian and apocalyptic narratives bleed into one another. What I mean by that phrase is that if certain dystopian visions fully developed the real conditions of the present in terms of the emerging or established dystopia being imagined, then those stories would truly become apocalyptic. So the two examples that I've considered of near future dystopias that incorporate severe environmental decay, but it fails to produce an apocalyptic narrative is Greg Rakas's Lazarus and Rick Remendez's Tokyo Ghost. Both stories depict near future worlds lying in ruin, and neither has reached the level of the apocalyptic. But not only because neither of them features massive human population death on par, but because both visions of the world develop particular currently existing social ills and they push them to extremes to produce a future most people would like to avoid. A very brief introduction to Rakas's Lazarus is that it presents a world that has been crippled by economic inequalities that have rendered governments moot and corporations servants of the powerful families that control the remaining infrastructure and resources. So what Raka, when he was asked in an interview, and what Raka says is that Lazarus is the answer to the question, what would happen if 1% lost control, if the economy tanked and there was no saving ourselves from the fallout? And the resulting story posits 16 family hegemonies that have divided up the world's landmass, resources, and population. Each family has authoritarian control over their domain, and the people who continue to inhabit the numerous provinces under their control. So, citizens are divided into two categories: waste and serfs. So, the former has no value, must be cared for minimally, and the latter provides crucial services to the families based on talents, skills, and attributes. Now, in spite of this societal collapse, which is the heart of the story, Lazarus does not really envision apocalyptic social collapse, even though there has been a definite reordering of the world in the context of a devastating global calamity. Quickly, Remendez's Tokyo Ghost, it posits a near future dystopia that emerges from society's addiction to technology, More than that, the world of Tokyo Ghost is the result of runaway consumption and a slow slide into the degradation of self deception and abuse. The story focuses on two locations: the techno dystopia, that is the Isle of Los Angeles, and the tech free Garden of Paradise, that is Japan. And the world of Tokyo Ghost represents a Huxleyan conception of the future where a population placated with drugs, violence, and various carnal distractions is unconcerned with the stark division of life in Los Angeles into the very wealthiest and everyone else. Unlike Lazarus, however, everyone in Remendez's near future can plug in and opt out. So, as long as their needs are met at some minimal level, the social world can continue on in spite of the fact that the environment is utterly destroyed. I hope I made sense. I'm really grateful for you for listening patiently to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ananda, for wonderfully sticking to the time. And yes, comic texts always have this subversive nature. This subversion, in turn, refers to a far more intrinsic understanding of the problem. We shall come back to your paper at the end of the session. Next is Trideep Khan. Trideep, I think, is there. So,
Yes.
yes,
Hello,
Trideep.
sir.
Go on.
Yes. Okay. I am working as a state-aided college teacher in the Department of English of Chandrakona Vidyasagar Mahavidyalaya, and my paper is Representation of the Climate Change and the Space of the Aborigine, a study of Alexis Wright's The Swan Book and Ojiro Nunakel's We Are Going. Some Aboriginal writers have narrated the historical facts regarding the settlement of the white people and making the Aboriginal people almost extinct. Ojiro Nunakel, in her We Are Going, has narrated thoroughly the plight of the Aborigines in Australia. The difficult issue with Alexis Wright's The Swan Book, it seems, is that it imagines a complex indigenous future not just for Australia but for the planet, and at a time when a different order of thinking about Australia's future is emerging powerfully from within indigenous communities. The Swan Book is about the world a century from now, but as an indigenous adaptation of the speculative fiction genre, it remediates the familiar Western mentality of past, present, and future. In this connection, Wright has emphasized more than once the Mexican writer Carol's sorry, sir, due to lack of electricity, I cannot read out it now.
So,
hello.
You may summarize your paper.
Okay. Thank you for giving me another chance. Alexis Wright's Swan Book talks about the plunder of the Aboriginal people, and at the same time, here Alexis Wright has compared Olivia, the protagonist of the Swan Book, with a swan, that is a species. And here Alexis Wright has presented human being as animal or just inferior to human being, and this group of people, that is the Aboriginal people, are plundered, subjugated, and exploited by the white people or white settlers. And in We Are Going by Cathay Walker, there is also the same story. That is, Cathay Walker has extensively stated about the plunder of the climate of Australia, that is the nature of Australia, and at the same time the plunder of the Aboriginal people, and both the text has put the Aboriginal people in the center, and the Aboriginal people are presented as a part and parcel of the nature, and the exploitation of the Aboriginal people are just exploitation of the nature. That is, the white people and the Aboriginal people are both both can say that belong to the Homo sapiens, that is the group, and again when it is coming to Australia, or when we are talking about the stories of the Aboriginal people or indigenous people of Australia, the social strata or the race are different, and that's why the Aboriginal people are not taken as human being, rather something animal, or we can say from this angle, Alexis Wright in his Inner Swan book has stated about animism also, and that's why she has used the imagery of the swan, which is in search of habitation, and Olivia, who is also in search of habitation. And in We Are Going also, the Aboriginal people are in the same condition. The difference is that We Are Going is presenting the present scenario, and the Swan book is presenting a scenario that is set in future. That is here. These two texts are more or less talking about the climate change and its effect on the indigenous people or indigenous community, and how they have been plundered, or how they have been put in a serious condition due to the plunder of the nature, or due to the climate change, like the swan is put in the Swan book.
Okay. I hope that's all.
Hello, sir. Okay.
Okay. So yes, we shall come back to your paper again at the end of the session. We shall move forward to Prithika. Prithika, are you there?
Yes, Prithika is present.
Well, Prithika, go on and make your presentation. Has Prithika left?
Prithika has left due to some technical
Maybe.
problem, perhaps.
So I think we can move on to Reshma now, and when Prithika rejoins, we can.
Resma is not present. She has informed that due to some medical emergencies, she will not be able to present her paper.
Then we move to Dr. Meenakshi Kulkarni. I hope she is here.
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Meenakshi.
Okay. Dr. Kulkarni, please go on and make your presentation.
Good evening, sir. Thank you, sir, for giving me the opportunity. I'll be presenting the paper on delving into climatic changes through Amitav Ghosh's Gun Island. Nature is a great experimenter. It experiments by discarding the species that are not supporting the whole, and it has constantly experimented over millions of years. There is a need to reevaluate anthropocentrism and believe that the earth equally exists for humanity, animals, and plants. Gun Island, a richly imaginative novel from Amitav Ghosh, of history of legends, environmentalism, and our place in a world threatened by global climate change. The story weaves a Bengali folk tale from the 17th century to the contemporary world, which is disrupted by human and animal migration, which has led to catastrophic events. A crisis in climatic change leads to crisis in culture too. Dean, a middle aged Bengali man and now an antique bookseller in Brooklyn, New York, is asked by a family friend to uncover the roots of obscure tale of the gun merchant, which has been verbally passed on. Dean is sent on a mission to discover what the details of the gun merchant's tale will soon discover that stories from the past have a way of impacting our lives in a complex, unimaginable ways. Sundarbans, one of the largest mangrove forests on earth, is also facing the brunt of growing greenhouse effect. How we can lose the beautiful forest can be analyzed in the paper. The angle of nature culture will also be taken up, and how nature emerges as the winner and breaks loose on humanity if she is misused. The present paper tries to explore the eco-critical concerns represented in the novel of Amitav Ghosh, namely Gun Island, which was published in 2019. It discusses the recurring themes of environmental conservation, man-animal conflict, and coexistence of humans with nature by referring to the novel. It also discusses a vast span of geographical locations to present the eco-critical sensibility. While the Sundarban is an example in West Bengal, serves as an example of conflict zone as well as coexistence. Italian waters present a zenith of harmony between humans and natural life. In the introduction to the eco-criticism reader, Landmarks in Literary Ecology, Cheryl Geofelti raises a serious question about the scarcity of environmental issues reflected in literary studies. The book was published in 1996. All over the globe, many endeavors have been undertaken to seriously consider eco-criticism as an indispensable position in literary theory and criticism since then. But in the Indian context specifically, we still come across few academic activities, research, or literature which dedicatedly focus on eco-criticism. And when we call literature as a mirror turned up to nature, only human environment or society gets considered here. As a result, the academia largely misses out on serious discussions about the most vital and equally endangered phenomenon of environment. In his monumental non-fiction work, The Great Derangement, 2018, Amitav Ghosh reflects, it could be even said that fiction that deals with climate change is almost by definition not of the kind that is taken seriously by serious literary journals. The mere mention of the subject is often enough to relegate a novel or short story to the genre of science fiction. It is through the literary imagination climate change was somehow akin to extraterrestrial or interplanetary levels. Are the currents of global warming too, while to be navigated in the accustomed barks of narration? But the truth, as it is now widely acknowledged, is that we have entered a time when the wild has become a norm. If certain literary forms are unable to negotiate these torrents, then they will have failed, and their failure will have to be counted as an aspect of the broader imaginative and cultural failure that lies in the heart of the climatic crisis. Therefore, a novelist like Amitav Ghosh stands out in this background that has raised critical and multi-pronged questions in his fiction and non-fiction works regarding nature, natural environment, human nature equation, and the urgent need to arrest environmental degradation. He acutely expresses how developing countries.
Sorry for interrupting. Could you conclude in a minute?
Oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Definitely. I'm concluding it. Are caught between the catch-22 situation regarding development and ecological conservation. So he also discusses the recurring themes of environmental conservation, man-animal conflict, and coexistence of human with nature by alluding to the novel. Thank you so much, sir, for giving me the opportunity to present my paper.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Kulkarni. Yes, Ghosh's attachment to Sundarban has been reflected not only in the Gun Island, in so many other texts, latest being the Jungle Nama, but we shall come back to all those issues later on in the session. We have to move on. Sumit, I think Pritika has joined. So can we accommodate her now? Or
I have sent a message to her that we will call her name at the end of the.
Okay. Then we move on now to Nayana from Muslim Arts. Nayana, are you there?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
Good
Go on.
afternoon, delegates of the House and Chairperson. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us today. I'm going to present African womanism and environmental crisis and analytical overview. African womanism is an ideology. It is applicable to all women of African descent. It is based on African culture. The African diaspora is a worldwide collection of communities descended from the native African or people from Africa, predominantly in the Americans. They are African American, Afro Caribbean, Afro Latin American, Black Canadian, West African, etc. Africana women are able to address environmental issues without partaking in the feminist activity. Some of the traditional values forefront the role of African mother leader in the struggle to regain, reconstruct, and create a cultural and environmental integrity. Africa faces serious environmental challenges including land degradation, deforestation, biodiversity loss, and extreme climate change. The large scale felling of trees and the reselling decreasing in forest areas are the main environmental issues of African continent. 90% of African population requires wood to use the fuel for heating and cooking. Degradation of the African soil causes decreased food production, damaging ecological effects, and an overall decrease in the quality of living Africa. African womanism shows that climate change impacts women more than men. It is not just a women in the rural areas who are affected globally. Women are more likely to experience poverty and to have less socio-economic power than men. This makes it difficult to recover from disasters which affect recover from the disasters, infrastructure, jobs and housing. In short, African women give greater priority to the protection of and improving the capacity of nature, maintaining farming, landing, and caring from the nature and the environment future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Nayana. Well, you have made us acquainted with African pluralism and you have tried to distinguish it from what is generally known as the trends of the feminist movements. Well, we shall have another look at it at the end.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you so much.
Next presenter, Dr. Subhasri. Dr. Subhasri, I think.
Can you hear me, sir? Hello? This is
Yes,
Dr.
we can
Subhasri.
hear you. Make your presentation.
Yes, I have my PPT. Just a second. Is my PPT visible?
Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I'll go ahead. I'm Dr. Subhasri. I'm working as an assistant professor at Bharatidasan Government College for Women, Pondicherry. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity to present my ideas in this wonderful 3-day webinar, international webinar, and listening to all the eminent speakers. It's really wonderful. And to start my paper, I have titled my paper, Trauma to Catastrophe in Climate Fiction, a critical study of Manjula Padmanabhan's Sharing Air and Amitav Ghosh's A Town by the Sea. To begin with, I would like to say, like, these are the things which are there in my paper. I have spoken something on, like, I will just very briefly say what is climate fiction I happen to discuss, then climate trauma, then an overview of the 2 short stories, and from the aspect of climate trauma, These short stories are analyzed, concluding remarks, and were cited. So, what exactly is climate fiction? Climate fiction or li-fi, it has that name. It was actually coined by an American freelance writer, Dan Bloom, in the year 2011 during a press release of a novel, Polar City Red, which was set amid the climate refugees in future Alaska. And from that moment onwards, the term climate fiction or cli-fi became the buzzword in the academia, and so much has been dealt with this particular term. Mostly themes of science fiction and dystopian themes, they prevail in the writings of climate fiction, and mostly they portray very bleak and very apocalyptic kind of depictions are portrayed. And this particular writings is not something very new. Maybe the terminology is new, but it started way back from the days of Jules Verne, the famous French science fiction writer. And this has gained prominence with the awakening of the Kyoto Protocol and the global warming scenario worldwide. In this paper, I would like to, I happen to say something about what is called climate trauma, which is actually a kind of a departure from climate fiction, and how a catastrophe slowly impacts not only the human entities but also non-human entities. And in the words of E. Ann Kaplan, I quote, she uses a term called pre-trauma, or the traumatic imagining of future catastrophes wherein an individual undergoes pre-traumatic stress syndrome. This is evidently visible in both the stories, and in one story it is a kind of a science fiction, but it comes under the domain of climate fiction, wherein the author Manjula Padmanabhan, she says about an event from the future, wherein an unnamed narrator, she brags about her purchase of what is called as a selection of antique atmospheres from 5 cities blend. That is what she gets, to quote the words of the narrator. And right now she's living in a pollution-free environment where the global population has come to drastically to a lower level because of pollution, air pollutions, and climatic changes. And she gives a very lengthy kind of a sketchy description how really human beings are missing out the niceties of nature, like basking in the sun, dancing in the rain, etc. And there is also a club called Toxic Club, wherein periodically they are actually taken to visit a decommissioned nuclear plant, and they are made to experience the natural air, which is not the natural air for them actually. And she says how the traumatic experience is really has caught the lives of individuals, and they blame their forefathers for really making the world, planet Earth, an unlivable planet kind of an experience. That is what happens in the first story. In the second story, Amitav Ghosh's The Town by the Sea, it's not more of a story, it's more of an account of the deadly Indian Ocean tsunami, which took place in the year 2004. And here Ghosh very sympathetically showcases the loss of the director of an institution in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, especially the personal loss of the director losing his family members, and he remains very stoic, but still Ghosh very, very brilliantly shows how human beings, they were gripped by the tsunami, and also the fury of nature is meticulously portrayed here. To quote a line from Ghosh's story, I'll be as briefly as possible. I quote, "The emotion he felt for his family," that is the director, "he had rarely expressed. He had hoarded it inside himself. He had never dreamed, and who could, that one bright December day, soon after dawn, it would be stolen, unsavored by the sea." End quote. And here and there, Ghosh intersperses how not only human beings but also non-human entities, that is animals and the flora and fauna, got totally disturbed because of the Indian Ocean tsunami that was really portrayed in this particular story. To conclude, climate trauma is something happening right now, and we human beings must act right now. As Professor Claude Savick rightly said, we have only one home, that is our planet Earth, and we must preserve it. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Subhasri. Uh, Next in line is Donna Soman. In fact, it's a joint paper.
Yes, sir.
Who will present? Donna Sonam or Soman or
Donna
Renu?
Soman.
Donna Soman. Go ahead. Make your
I'll be
presentation.
sharing my PPT now.
Okay.
I hope it's visible. Is it
Yes.
visible?
Yes.
Okay. My paper is titled Mythical Imagination and the Young Minds, a reading of Geeta Dharmarajan's Ma Ganga and the Razai Box, which is a metaphor of hope in disaster. So first of all, I would be talking about how mythical stories are important for the upbringing of children. Indigenous epistemological stories directly appeal to the affective dimensions of learning. Affective here means the feelings, the emotion, which can lead to motivation. That is, the stories can actually motivate them to form perceptions, to form a value. So it's a value based education about the world around them, what kind of relationship exists with the factors or elements outside them. Myths, according to Art Stravinsky, attempt to make the world intelligible and as such constitute a unique form of discourse through which we gain an understanding of our place in the world and how to live in it. These stories are a storehouse of ecological and cultural values, making it an indispensable resource for writers of children's literature across generations. These stories play an active role in forming the subjectivity of a child by developing on the reciprocal relationship. What kind of relationship exists? How is it reciprocal, or it should be reciprocal between human and the other non-human entities. The tendency among the children's authors operating on myths entail a return to the past, rediscovering and often retelling them to suit the contemporary scene. Mythological underpinnings in the form of metaphorical narrations. That is the retelling of mythological stories. If we take for in the context of India, the Palace of Illusions by Chitra Banerjee Divakaruni, which is a feminist retelling of Mahabharata, the Shiva trilogy by Amish Tripathi, the Krishna Key by Ashwin Sanghi, among others. So we can see a lot of retellings of mythological stories, even in the case of adult fiction as well as children's fiction. So the tales with the metaphors, the imagery, it tends to be more appealing to the children, and it leads to higher order creative thinking, imagination, and the consistent themes are creation, survival, death, healing, human dependence on natural world, etc. So it is very much appealing to the young readers. It attracts, or it engages the attention of the children. There is a shift in purpose with which mythical stories were conceived, with focus shifting from explanations on creation of world, natural disasters, to reflections of hope. So, when we think of the state of the present catastrophe of Earth, some of the literature for children, it makes immense use of mythical elements, which actually generate a kind of hope. A positive thrust is being envisioned, in which uh, uh, they are presented with a scope for a Earth full of vibrancy, as if these stories are motivating them to take action to for a recovery of the lost Eden. So, in this story, Geeta Dharmarajan exemplifies the urgency on the part of writers of children's fiction to engage with mythological imagination and wisdom to comment on environmental concerns. The short story depicts a resilient movement towards a rebalancing of the species, leading to a more sustainable relationship with the natural environment. in this story, as in the case of many of the children's literature books, we are present with a visual spectacle. That is, it is an illustrator storybook with pictures. And in these illustrations, we can see personification of river Ganga, and imagining the matted hairs of Lord Shiva. So it uses a lot of imagery. So in a nutshell, the plot of the story can be briefed like the main protagonist is a young girl named Yasho, and she is called Yasho of the hill people throughout the story. And she complains to Ma Ganga, or the Ganga river, that the Ganga is flooding her village. And Ma Ganga tells her that I am not responsible. If you bring Shiva's matted hair and spread it on my banks, I will stop flowing. I will stop flooding your village. Until then, I will be going and hiding in your Razai box. So that's how the story progresses. And Yesho and her people, all the other villagers, they realize that they should plant trees so that the trees will hold the soil, and then the Ma Ganga can, or the Ganga river can flow without encroaching actually the banks. So as I said earlier also, this story, it is full of pictures, and these are two pictures which I have pasted here. On the left side, you can see how the village of Yesho has turned after Ganga ceases to flow. So after Ganga goes and hides in her Razai box, and when it stops flowing, it is turned into a barren land. So it suggests the present state where either we are faced with flood, or when flood stops, there is a complete drought. So a natural disaster, or you can also say it's a man-made disaster. So these are the barren hills of Yasho's village, and later on, when the people realize that it has to be
Please
retrieved.
conclude in a minute.
Yes, sir. So that's how it is lost verdancy is retrieved. So I will quickly tell about the story. And you all know, some of you may be knowing Bhagiratha. He was a Ikshaku dynasty king, and with his penance, river Ganga flowed into her earth, and with all her force, when she was trying to flow, Lord Shiva decided to prevent the disaster, because if she flows with all her force, everything on this earth will be devastated. So he undid his locks across the sky and caught her, stopped her force, and released her slowly to the ground, so that her flow can be regulated, and thus directing the route of the holiest river. So this is a story which you can find in Hindu mythology, and this is one of the pictures which is present inside the book. So in this, Shiva's matted locks are nothing but a metaphor for roots and branches of trees, which hold the soil together and thus prevent flooding and soil erosion. It is in this context that stories use myths can be considered as a means of recovery that has been severed in terms of a more imbricated relationship of human beings to nature. We can interpret myths in a way that metaphors are interpreted, opening new possibilities of restructuring of symbolic universes on the basis of root metaphors nuanced by narrative myths. So in conclusion, the story touches upon the post-human thought, reiterating the age-old philosophy that how human life is interconnected with all non-human presences, the reciprocity of which was denied for so long, and the recognition of which is elemental in healing the present planetary state. Myths of Paradise Lost and Recovered have most often inspired contemporary writers who, rather than lamenting the historical loss of wilderness, delves on metaphors of hope and regeneration, uplifting the upcoming generations to take steps to heal and transform the earth into a livable habitat. Geeta Dharmarajan here reflects upon negotiations with mythical possibilities and contemporary ecological thought to envision a better future in the face of calamities. Thank you.
Okay, that was an interesting paper, like the previous ones. We now move on to our next presentation, which is once again a joint presentation of Rajdeep Vijayaraj and Prachi Godaria. So, who will make the presentation? Rajdeep or Prachi?
Sir, both of us will do it jointly.
So we have divided the time.
Okay. But please stick to the time limit.
Yes. Sir.
Okay,
Sure.
go on.
So is our
Yes, sir.
presentation visible?
Yes.
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. So we'll start. Good afternoon, everyone present here. Our paper is titled "I Feel the Ground Shake: Eco-Precarity and Post-Colonial Disaster Narrative" in Janet Armstrong's "This Is a Story." Armstrong is a native Canadian writer and activist. She was born in Okanagan in Canada, which is also where the short story is set. The ecology in this Okanagan Valley in Canada, in this story, is rendered precarious because of its colonization by the quote-unquote swallow people, which is the term that the colonizers are referred with. And particularly, this precariousness is because of the construction of dams. The precarious environment then threatens the livelihood and culture of the natives. The natives are no longer able to catch salmon, this fish salmon, which is a symbol of both native livelihood and culture in the story. The natives then have to depend on swallow food, which makes them sick. Colonial encounters, as we have known, often lead to disease outbreaks as the native population does not have any immunity to viruses or the bacteria that are common among the invading population. To be noted is the fact that the disaster in the story is not sudden. The dams are gradually built while Coyote is on a long nap. Although natural disasters may seem swift in contrast, however, these disasters require many times man-made interventions that take a long time to manifest as the environment is rendered more and more precarious with time. The dams are a new concept for the natives, and that is why the dams are described in a defamiliarized manner as a huge thing across the river at Grand Coulee, instead of referring to them as dams. The construction of the dams indirectly caused sickness in the natives. I quote, Coyote had seen lots of people in really bad shape. They walked around with their minds hurt. They couldn't see or hear good anymore. Their bodies were poisoned. They didn't care much for living anymore, unquote. Here we can see how the physical structure imposed upon nature, that is the dam, causes two things. One, physical weakness in the natives, and two, mental issues and despair. This precarity also destabilizes the native culture and the manner in which the natives view themselves. For instance, the village headman says that we need the swallows, that is the colonizers, because they are smart and what they do is right. They know how to live right, and we have to become like them. This discourse is very common in colonial societies, even in post-colonial societies, where what the colonizer did or is doing is what is considered as right. One can assert then that the village headman and the followers have thus been interpolated in the Arthurian term into the colonial ideology. However, at the same time, one sees that there are narratives of resistance also in the story. At the end of the frame narrative, Coyote declares that I am going to break the dams. I am hungry, and that young one at the river, that is a native, has waited long enough. All my children will eat salmon again. With this declaration, we can see an anti-colonial turn in the narrative. More about this will be continued by Prachi.
Thank you. Coyote, in fact, is a symbol of resistance in the story, while the dams are a symbol of colonization and colonial control. There's a mythical figure named Coyote in Navajo traditions, of which Coyote is a representation of. Coyote is a mischievous spirit who's often seen in myths as a defender of the people. Nature and native become one in this aspect, as Coyote and the river, that's elements of nature, benefit the natives. The dam is also apparently better than the last times, as an older woman tells Coyote, I don't think it's made of spit and clay like the other time, but it's made something like that. So it's taking the idea that the natives have and building on that. A narrative of development is being weaved into this progress in the materials used in building the dam. Such historist narratives were used by colonizers to relegate colonized nations into underdeveloped savage places. This is also seen in Robinson Crusoe, where there's a savage and a colonizer. The swallow people also keep their houses well maintained by working on them day in and day out till they drop dead. Basically, keeping the elements of nature outside the home, creating a very clear demarcation between the inside and the outside, which can also be seen in the contrast between the colonizer and the nature native duo. Moreover, The narrator nowhere mentions a pronoun for Coyote, which means or which shows that there is no pronoun, thus there is no gender, and therefore Coyote is all of the natives. They stand for everyone. Such a resistance to being encapsulated into an English pronoun exhibits the main character's belief in the anti-colonial potential of the figure of Coyote. The frame narrative helps set up a brilliant contrast between the true story of the past, where the Canadian region was first colonized, and the present time when Canada still remains a settler colony. The frame narrative also indirectly hints at the aftermath of Coyote's call for resistance. It is after Coyote sleeps that Swallow people take over Okanagan. The narrator of the story, however, resists sleep while guarding the fire, a reference to guarding the native people and nature against the oppression of the colonizers. Coyote wanted to reinstate the native food habits and culture by breaking the dams, but now the river has oil slicks, perhaps making fishing even more difficult. Moreover, the ground shook, and the narrator still feels the ground shake, which signifies that the precarity is made literal over here and it's an ongoing process. Conclusion: the eco-precarity and the destruction of the nature and culture of post-colonial societies is thus an ongoing process. Newer forces of globalization or imperialism that characterize late capitalism still keeps the post-colonial nations at a significant disadvantage. However, this same late capitalism has pushed even the former colonizer nations into an era of precarity. Could the post-colonial world now pave a way out of this precarity? With this hopeful question, we would like to end our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajiv and Prachi, for a very interesting presentation. But we have to move on. Maybe we'll come back to it later on. Now we move to Jara Ahmed. Jara, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Okay, yes, go on and make your presentation.
Good day to one and all present here. My topic is environmental catastrophe on Amitabh Ghosh, the Hungry Tide. Man has ruled and exploited nature since time immemorial. Escalating environmental issues pose threat to the humans and environment. Ghosh's novel, The Hungry Tide, set in Sundarban, deals with the wrath of nature and the colonial suppression, emphasizes on the understanding and conservation of life in the Sundarbans, giving the local issues a global effect. This paper depicts the environmental issues of Sundarbans faced by its human and non-human inhabitants and show the human and non-environmental relationship and needs to conserve nature. Nature is regenerated but also a revenger. Man is threatened with survival crisis due to its varied ill effects of nature and natural disasters like famine, drought, flood, and earthquakes. Due to negligence and degradation of ecosystem, environmental concerns have become a global crisis. Some of the prominent actors like Aldo Leopold, Pangari Mathai, and Rachel Carson. Amitabh Ghosh is one of India's leading contemporary English writers. His works include Shadowline, The Glass Palace, Sea of Poppies, River of Smoke, etc. And there are many writings on environment and danger it faces. Eco-criticism begins from the conviction that the art of imagination and the study thereof by virtue of the grasp of power of word, story, and image to reinforce, enliven, and direct environmental concern can contribute significantly to the understanding of environmental problems, the multiple forms of eco-degradation that afflict planet Earth today, as said by Buell et al. These are some of the pictures of Sundarbans National Park, the Madlands, satellite image of Sundarbans released by NASA Earth Observatory, Irrawaddy dolphins found there, and the Royal Bengal tiger. Conservation is a state of harmony between men and land, as said by Aldo Leopold. The Hungry Tide is the study of Sundarbans, a beautiful forest, home to 1,000 species, including human and non-human, designated by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site and Biosphere Reserve. Based on Ghosh's reaction in his essay, Folly in the Sundarbans against the Sahara India Parivar, an industrial house proposal to build a mega tourism project in the area, he wrote the fictional work for this world's richest mangrove forest of Delta. This novel is written in the backdrop of Sundarban, shows the shifting nature of the life in the Delta. It shows the role of human versus non-human, contesting power paradigms, which frequently gets interchanged. Nature writing is based on scientific information and facts in this novel. These lines serves an example of it. Analytical study of impact Ghosh, the Hungry Tide, has been done focusing upon the methods employed in crafting them to explore the endangered environment. Ghosh makes a case for indigenous inhabitants who were considered a direct threat. The story of Monbebe in the text reflects the need to respect the environment despite its inconsistent and intimidating nature. People of Sundarbans are often relocated after cyclonic storms when their homes and lands are washed in the sea due to human interferences. Local people need to be sensitized on environmental issues of global warming and its impact on their islands. The Sundarban is only a case in point. There are several other endangered ecosystems on planet Earth. It is a moral responsibility and accountability on the part of every human to conserve our environment. The need of the hour is to build a future that strikes a balance between man and his surroundings. Environmental issue values and studies need to be inculcated in young minds, along with the idea of compulsory human responsibility to save planet Earth. In short, the well-being of our environment, our planet Earth, is in our hands, and we ought to renegotiate and realign our relationship with it. As Pia and Kanai and Ghosh text make deliberate decision to conserve the people and environment of the Sundarbans, with commitment by relocating themselves to the place. Ghosh text here is a source of creating awareness, ecological consciousness, and sensitizing the readers to the unique mangrove forests of the world to conserve and sustain planet Earth for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Zara, for drawing our attention again to Amitabh Ghosh. I think, Sumit, now we can accommodate the one who was left out, Prithika, I think.
Prithika, yes. Prithika is present.
Prithika, are you
Good
there?
afternoon, sir. Yeah, I'm here.
Yes,
Am I
go on.
audible?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am, you are audible.
Thank you.
Please
Thank
go
you
on.
for the chance. Is my screen visible? Hello?
No, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
It's visible now.
Okay, now it's visible.
Yeah, my paper is on. My name is S. Preetika from Avinash Lingam Institute, Coimbatore, Tamil Nadu. I'm doing my PhD, and my paper is on victims of environmental hazards in Jonathan Hare's A Civil Action. This is a book which was based on real incidents, and this is a non-fiction considered to other sort of works and novels. But this book really goes like a novel, and we can understand how to deal with the environmental hazards we face today is affecting human beings now. And this is more like a contemporary work, even though it was published in 1995. The novel sort of a book, and it is based on the case of Anderson and Krajewak. Author himself is a lawyer, so he has based on his experience and has made this book a thriller. So this is a statement from International Crime Threat Assessment, where they say that environmental crime has been identified as one of the most profitable and fast-growing area in the international criminal activities. One second. Hello. Activities with increasing involvement of organized criminal networks. So, as we know, every development is based on this nature. Nature has been the stepping stone for development. So, this plot line starts with leukemia cluster, where we find that children are dying out of leukemia, which is a cancer, in one place called Wuhan. But after people keep on knowing that many children are dying in the same place, they come together and they file a case in the court, even when they are not sure what is causing the effect. So they go to this lawyer and they file a case. So this lawyer spends large amount of expensive research works, and he does extensive research at a cost of millions and millions he spends on this. But later when the success comes, it's not the same. He cannot, he goes bankrupt. He finds the truth. He even goes to the extent of taking loan from banks and doing all this stuff, but he goes bankrupt when he finds the truth. And even when the case is a success, it is a tragic event for that person. And after that, after the story, there is one sort of epilogue. I think author makes it clear that even after this, there is hope. So he brings in Environmental Protection Agency from US government, bringing in a large scale chemical cleanup of the history. So in this, I was focusing on victims. So there is one perfect line in the text where they say the perfect victim is a white male profession, 40 years old, at the height of his earning power. And in the last line, it is an underlying line where they say a dead child is worth the least of all. So the value of a human life, a child who is going to be a man someday, is worth nothing when it comes to a case of legal stage. So that is what was happening. The perpetrators here are the big industries who the common people has to face after all the researchers. The lawyer went for research and all things, but now they have to face the big industries. So with all this, the pointers of the paper are the value of nature is in its market worth, and the eco disaster that is happening with people is a form of slow violence. It is very slow and it takes time and research. So have to research to even understand what is causing such a cancer. And people, they keep on questioning, they do research, they redo the research, they criticize the research, and all this happens. And the science that we have today is not to the point. It is really far behind for this fast changing world and all these chemical symptoms. And as we know, Rachel Carson also pointed to disinformation, pointed to this term called disinformation, where we are not aware, we are not informed. And with social media is not giving the right answers now because it is behind. So in this, the nature is docile and voiceless until anthropocentric fight arises. This whole case starts with so the author in the last epilogue is through protecting the victim. He says the use of organized government approach will give a good economy that should be supported by legal and economic backup. So to conclude, I want to note this, that analyzing of the simple symptoms now and finding organized solutions today can protect large eco victims tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Pritika. Despite the snag in the audio, you made your point to the presentation.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
I think there is one more, Shamit.
Yes, sir.
Is
Dr.
the
Robbie
presentation
CM, Dr. Robbie CM, Assistant Professor, Department of English, University College of Arts, Tumkur University, Tumkur, Karnataka. The title of his paper is Literary and Artistic Concerns of Environment.
Okay.
Yes,
Dr.
sir.
Ravi, go on.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I am here.
Yes, make your presentation.
Yeah. I would like to make my presentation on this topic where I want to discuss how literature and art show a lot of concern as far as our environment is concerned. So if you take an account of literature, you come to know that how literature and art have been in constant use for the portrayal of physical environments and human environment interactions. So, this is an interesting fact that we have to consider when we take up the study of environment in connection with literature and art. So both literature and art, they engage constantly to find out how what kind of interactions that the human world has with the world, with the physical world which is around it. The emergence of modern environmentalist movement in the late 19th century has given birth to a wide range of fictional and non-fictional writings which deal mainly with humans ever-changing relationship with natural world around him. This is an interesting contribution by this environmentalist movement that began in late 19th century. They try to show in most of their right in most of their efforts how the kind of fictional and non-fictional writings which focus more on the ever-changing relationship with the natural world around human beings. This long-lasting interest in continuation of literary studies in these matters of human relationship with the environmental matters generated an initiative which is most commonly known as eco-criticism. So, which is one of the interesting theories of literature. So, eco criticism plays a very crucial role in understanding the kind of relationship that we have with the world, with the environment which is around us. So, eco criticism mainly focuses on the purpose is to study literature and environment from an interdisciplinary point of view. It also helps the literary scholars to analyze texts that illustrate environmental concerns and to examine the various ways through which literature treats the subject of nature. So, eco criticism lays certain principles which help most of the scholars and researchers for their analysis and interpretation of the environmental concerns and also environmental concerns that the literature and art show with. At times, eco-criticism sometimes it converges with its sister disciplines in the humanities. So, anthropology, they are uh, environmental anthropology, environmental history, and environmental philosophy. In the first two sections, so what I decided to do in my article was to give a brief overview of the nature, significance, and evolution of literature that deals with more of the environment and the physical world around us. So then I also attempted to summarize three specific centers of interest. The first was to the imagination of place and place attachment, and then the enlistment and critique of models of scientific inquiry, in the study of literature and art, the examination of the significance of gender difference and environmental representation. So this is what I actually plan to do in my paper. So as I had lot of time constraint, I was not able to send my complete paper and send to you in a very short while from now. Thank you for the opportunity.
Uh, Thank you for providing the overview. And with this, Sumit, I think we have come to the end of presentations.
Yes, sir.
Well, now all the papers are open for discussion, questions, commentaries, and is there anyone passing any comment or putting any question to any of the 10 papers? All papers, I should say, were good attempts at trying to do justice to their focus. And I must thank the presenters for that. Now, the papers are open. So if there is any question or any comment, you can just unmute yourself and put your question or pass your comment.
Is there one thing I must share with you, that the young researchers and the young students are now today very much sensitive about the environmental disaster. So it's a good sign, isn't it? There are many presentations which are made by the PG students.
Yeah,
and they have started.
They were good attempts actually. Good attempts at trying to analyze the issues. Yes, that's a very heartening fact.
Yes. So the presenters, would you like to make any question or share your commentaries with us, share your views? The session is open for questions, open for discussion. So if you have any question, you can share or you can ask. So we think that there is no question. So please wrap up the session.
Yes, I will just try to wrap up the session with a brief comment on the papers that have been presented. We have had two papers on Ghosh. Gun Island is one and Hungry Tide is another. And obviously, in any discussion on environmental awareness or eco-criticism or a seminar like this on a literary representation of environmental disaster, Ghosh obviously occupies an important place of discussion. And quite rightly, we had papers on Ghosh's novels, Ghosh's writings, and then we also had the first presenter was what is her name? Ananda. Yes, she was pointing out how the comics and graphic novels, they in a subversive way, they tried to draw our attention to the environmental hazards. Then it was Trideep's paper, who also brought together two novels, Swan Book and We Are Going, and how those two were trying to look at the same issue at the same local, of course, at two different time periods. The sixth paper, I think it was Naina, who tried to focus on African womanism and try to distinguish between the environmental activities of movement from traditional feminism. Then we had a very interesting paper on climate trauma, and the joint presentation of Rajdeep and Prachi. That was quite interesting in the way they have looked at the different metaphors. In a similar way, the earlier presenter, Donna Summer, also tried to look at reinvention of myth to address current environmental issues. I have already mentioned the hungry type, that was Jarad's presentation, which was a good presentation again. And Prithika, she also drew our attention to environmental crimes and how in this legal wrangle, ultimately the real victims are left to suffer. Finally, Dr. Robishian tried to provide an overview of eco-criticism. Now, one thing, since most of them, though not all, are young budding scholars, one advice that I would like to offer to all of them is that these days when we are too much into this theory and we are using terminologies associated with the theories, all these terms are very loaded terms. So always be careful while using these theoretical terms. They are all loaded terms, and while you or before using it, you should be very clear in your concepts about what to use and when to use. With best wishes to all those young scholars, and of course, with thanks to all of them that they have all tried their best to make valuable contributions to this seminar. I think we can now come to the end of the session. Of course, at the end, I would express once again my thanks to the authorities of Seva Bharati Mahavidyalaya, the organizers, and particularly Sharif.
Thank you, sir. Thank you all the paper presenters for your valuable contributions to the theme of the webinar. Each of the paper, I must say, is a product of sincere research work and profound love for the subject. Congratulations, every paper presenter, for your wonderful presentations and for your active participation in the 3-day international webinar on Imagining Catastrophe, Literary and Cultural Representations of Environmental Disaster. I also express my profound gratitude to Dr. Snehasis Maiti, the Honorable Chairperson of this Technical Session 4, for giving us time and for sharing his valuable ideas and comments on the paper. Now, I'd request all the paper presenters and the participants to join the main session for the valedictory session. So please join the main session. We'll have there the valedictory session. Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Sir, should I stop the recording, sir?
Yes, yes.
Oh, thank you, sir.